this year marks the 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster and the 5th anniversary of the Fukushima disaster. And there's been a kind of, the last month or so, there's been really kind of a convergence of great interest in this general topic. And of course, especially when there's a topic where we know relatively little, and it's kind of surprising, it's been 30 years since Chernobyl, and we still know relatively little about the health and environmental consequences of the disaster. It is kind of interesting that there's great debate, and this again stems from the fact that we know relatively little, or people claim that we know relatively little. The largest disaster, nuclear disaster in the history of the world was the Chernobyl disaster 30 years ago. Contaminated very significant parts of northern Ukraine, about a third of Belarus, large expanses of southwestern Russia, but also what most people don't realize is that large parts of Central Europe, Austria, Germany, northern Italy, and Scandinavia, and even parts of the UK were contaminated as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. In fact, the radionuclides were dispersed in the upper atmosphere around the planet, and you can actually one of the problems right now with measurement of Japanese food products is that you can also detect the cesium signal from Chernobyl in some of these products. And in fact, you know, some of the imported mushrooms and berries and things like that still show up as being above regulatory limits from Eastern Europe. So this is an issue. Major impacts. Fukushima, on the other hand, was about a tenth in terms of terrestrial impacts, about a tenth of Chernobyl, plus or minus. We don't know what the total impacts to the marine side will be. We do know that there are ongoing inputs of radionuclides leaking into the ocean every day, and plus periodic major spills, especially when there's a typhoon that goes through. So these are all concerns that people have related to these two events. My group has been, we started working in Chernobyl as kind of a hobby thing. I'm actually an evolutionary biologist, evolutionary geneticist. I used to work on the genetic basis of sexual behavior in exotic insects, and this was good stuff, but not particularly widely read. But NSF, my funding agency, thought it was fine. They gave us lots of money to do it, and the work was always published. But come on, the genetics of sex in an insect, it's a little bit narrow focus. But we got started in Chernobyl just by accident about 16 years ago, and it started as a hobby. Mainly an excuse to visit southern Spain once a year, where our control populations were, and we'd go for a week or two, study some birds, study some insects, write a paper or two to justify our time away, and that was really pretty much the extent of it for the first few years. But then we started to realize that, hey, something's going on here. There are actually strange anomalies in these populations. We were interested in seeing how elevated mutation rates in natural populations would change the course of evolutionary response of these natural populations, and we were seeing rather strange things going on. And anyway, we've been to Chernobyl many times, Fukushima many times now, published a bunch of papers, and I did want to, again, I always point this out, just in case you get the wrong idea from what I talk about today. We're not anti-nuclear activists. That's not our mission in life. We're simply evolutionary biologists looking for discovery of new phenomena in the natural world. But 5 years into our sort of hobby program in Chernobyl, this report came out of the International Atomic Energy Agency's Chernobyl Forum, and this is an expert group appointed by different government organizations, usually related to the nuclear field in some way. But they, in this expert forum, they claim to have reviewed the literature related to Chernobyl, and they came to the conclusion that and probably many of you in the audience have this same opinion, because it's one that's been perpetuated by the Disney Channel, among others, the fact that it looks like many of the animals are thriving inside the Chernobyl zone because there's a fence around it and there's no hunting. And by implication, the suggestion by this report is that that the radiation effects are minimal to none. And of course, one of the problems is they've also made similar suggestions with respect to human health issues. They've suggested that the vast majority of them stem from stress-related diseases related to the disaster. And there's no doubt that that's important as well, but they've used that to justify ignoring or not investing in proper research related to health effects as well. But this really gave us a boot in the pants in terms of motivating us to go do some more rigorous studies. And let me just skip ahead. But anyway, 2006, you could make the claim that there wasn't a lot of research being done in Chernobyl up to that point, although I'll show you that there had been. 2013, 2 years after the Fukushima disaster, another committee, another United Nations committee, the UNSCAR committee, which is responsible for reviewing the literature associated with radiation effects, they come out and say that we don't expect there to be any consequences for the biota, and I'm focusing on the biota here, related to the disaster because the emissions, the deposition levels were just too low to be of any significant consequence based on our models of expected dose and response. And again, at this point we'd published probably 50 papers on Chernobyl effects and maybe 3 or 4 on effects that we'd seen in Fukushima. So we were a little taken aback that the UNSCAR committee, again, committee of experts, there may be even a member or two in the audience, I don't know. You know, that they would ignore this literature. And you might ask, why would they ignore this literature? And of course, the Director General of the IAEA, the person responsible for promoting the peaceful use of the atom, basically says the same thing, that we expect no effects and there's no literature to back up this claim. So that has kicked us in the pants as well to get going. So what I'd like to do today, again, is just sort of review a few key examples, mostly from the work that we've been doing for the last few years, and then hopefully bring it together at the end. But before we go there, we have to do, since this is a public lecture, we need to do a little Physics 101 review. Just basically, if you're looking at biological systems, there are really 2 modes of radiation effects that are of interest. There's probably more, but these are the 2 we're going to focus on today. And the first is that when you have radioactivity in the environment emitting alpha, beta, or gamma rays, they have some probability of causing direct damage to the DNA by breaking the chromosomes, causing single or double strand breaks in the chromosomes. And so this is sort of a direct effect of radiation. If the radiation is ingested, it's more likely to have these effects, but external radiation can have the same effect. Another indirect effect of radiation, probably more important, I'll try to make the case that it is, in most of the results we've seen, is the fact that by definition this radiation is ionizing radiation. It has the ability to split water into 2 ions, the hydrogen and the peroxide, and that these molecules are very chemically active and they cause damage to biological systems, both direct damage to the DNA, but also damage to the proteins, DNA repair system, the membranes, basically many aspects of the cellular system. And so these two pathways are quite important. So 2006, 10 years ago, after the Chernobyl Forum report came out indicating that there were no consequences of the radiation in Chernobyl, we decided that couldn't possibly be true, and so we did a literature review. You know, everyone starts with a literature review, and we did a sort of a crude analysis of the literature that existed up to that point, including the Eastern European literature that had been largely ignored, put it all together, wrote this review for Trends in Ecology and Evolution, a fairly respectable journal. And you don't have to read this, but basically this is the list of studies dealing just with some measure of genetic damage. There were about 34 studies that we could find that had some estimate of genetic damage related to Chernobyl that was tested in some relatively rigorous way. 29 of those showed significant effects of radiation. I think 4 of those were germline, so genetic damage that was inherited, passed from one generation to the next. So at the time of the Chernobyl Forum report, there was lots of evidence of genetic damage, and this was not mentioned in the form report at all. We've since just upgraded this analysis in a more rigorous way. We've added 10 years worth of studies, again, some of ours, some of other people's, and conducted a formal meta-analysis. And for those of you who are not in the business, the meta-analysis it's a technique that's becoming increasingly popular because it allows you to sort of mix and match various data sets that were collected in slightly different ways, but allows you to put it into a combined data set and to test hypotheses in a relatively rigorous way using the combined data. This paper came out, I guess, about a year ago, and what this plot shows are the individual studies. About 150, we found about 151 test cases for some measure of genetic damage, either sequence level genetic damage or deletions, insertions, or cytogenetic damage. There are many different measures, but putting them all on the same scale, and these are just each individual study. This is the 0 line. These are 95% confidence intervals. And what you see is that the vast majority of these test cases show significant, large genetic damage associated with this radiation. The overall pattern is incredibly highly significant. There's no chance this arose by chance alone. There's a couple of cases down here that show some positive effect, but these seem probably just random. So I think that we pretty much nailed that door shut. I think there's no doubt that the levels of radioactivity that we see in Chernobyl, so-called low-dose radioactivity, have serious consequences for the genetic systems. This is another recent result that attempts to tie together the mechanism, the potential mechanism of this genetic damage, whether it's direct or indirect. And so it's a literature review, again, looking at Chernobyl studies in both Eastern and Western literatures and extracting what we can find. And what the basic message from this paper is, and there's no real easy way to illustrate it graphically, but it's basically that individuals that suffer from oxidative stress show damage in relation to radiation exposure, whereas individuals that don't have oxidative stress, usually because they have high levels of antioxidants, don't show some kind of damage. So there's this trade-off between radiation exposure, antioxidants, oxidative stress, and injury, and very highly significant relationships. And the moral of the story is that you should eat your blueberries. Just make sure they're not from Ukraine, because the blueberry. One of the ironies is that the blueberries are really good at capturing cesium, and they concentrate cesium. So if the blueberries are from Ukraine, don't eat them, and don't eat the mushrooms either. But that's another issue. So what does it matter? Does this genetic damage have any significance really beyond just the genetic damage? And so to get at this, that's really been our major contribution, looking at what kinds of damage do you see and what levels of damage do you see. And I'm just going to run through a few examples for you. So one of the more interesting observations, both my partner in research, Anders Moller, and I were both really interested in behavior. We were both very interested in male-male competition and the evolution of sexual roles and things like that. And so we started actually working with male gametes, sperm of the birds, of male birds. And Anders had actually dug through the old literature and found a very old technique for special massaging therapy for the extraction of fresh sperm from these male birds, and without hurting them. And they'd actually calmly allowed themselves to be manipulated in this way. And what we found using this fresh genetic material, which is a proxy for the inherited genetic damage, was that, for instance, in the barn swallows, in more radioactive areas, up to 40% of the sperm were morphologically damaged in some way, deformed. And there's actually a whole taxonomy of sperm morphology damage because of all the interest with respect to human and animal breeding. And that was really interesting. And we found that the birds that showed the most damage to their sperm had the lowest levels of antioxidants in their blood, and vice versa. So again, another hint towards the mechanism. And it's interesting that earlier this year, a group out of Oxford, England, have been marketing a special dietary supplement for men with infertility problems. What is it? What do you think? It's an antioxidant supplement, yeah. It's really I thought that was really interesting. I wish I'd patented that one. A few years after the barn swallow studies, we actually gathered up about 500 males from a variety of different species and started looking at their sperm as well. And the basic message was that in the more radioactive areas, up to 40% of the birds in a given year were completely sterile. They had no sperm or just a few dead sperm. We thought this was interesting because, of course, it's a frequent outcome of radiation therapy for males with prostate cancer to be temporarily or permanently sterile. So it's not new knowledge, it's not anything new. It's just had never been observed in the Chernobyl setting. But clearly, if you're sterile, you're not going to be contributing to the gene pool of the next generation. Another character that is, has been widely known to be indicative of radiation exposure are early onset cataracts in the eye. Everyone who lives long enough is going to get cataracts, but it's pretty unusual to see cataracts in the eyes of children. And it was really first noticed in some of the children born to women who were pregnant at the time of the atomic bombs in Japan. And this is a little poster from Hiroshima, the museum in Hiroshima, talking about it. And so we thought we should look at some of our wild animals living in low-dose environments in Chernobyl. And lo and behold, when we looked at the birds, several hundred of them, again, the frequency and intensity of the cataracts was much higher in the areas of high background radiation. And again, you can actually take photos of them, although it turns out that ophthalmology is kind of an art form. I hadn't realized just how much it was. But if you spend a lot of time, you can actually get a few photos, but mostly it's a subjective scaling. We've since added rodents to our repertoire in both Chernobyl and Fukushima and found the same thing in the rodents. Much higher frequency of cataracts and severity of cataracts. And they're of the type that we associate with radiation exposure, being on the posterior part of the lens. And they reflect, it's well known that this kind of cataract is associated with oxidative stress. And so radiation-induced oxidative stress in this case. Right, next. Another frequent observation from the atomic bomb survivors was cognitive problems and smaller head sizes, smaller brain sizes, again for children who were in utero at the time. And what's of course interesting is that there had been a few case studies in the medical literature from women who had gone for either X-ray treatment in the 1920s and 30s, who went in for X-ray treatment or radium treatment for cervical cancer. At the time, they really had no way to tell, if a woman was really pregnant, I guess. They didn't have ultrasound at the time. And so there were a number of cases where children were born to these women who had had treatment who had, again, serious mental retardation problems and smaller head sizes, often extremely small microencephaly kind of conditions. So we looked at our birds and, again, this really surprised us, but the brain size of these birds was on average 5% lower in the more contaminated areas. And that may not sound like a lot, but we're talking about birds, so 5% is significant. And we know it's significant because the birds with the smaller brains, the smallest brains, had half the chance of surviving from 1 year to the next, implying that there were cognitive consequences of this reduced brain size. We've also now looked at it for the rodents in both Chernobyl and Fukushima and found the same general pattern of reduction. And again, it's not really surprising. It's known from the medical literature that neurological tissues development is very susceptible to, very vulnerable to oxidative stress. And so this kind of phenomenon has been reported repeatedly, again, just not for any kind of natural radioactive situation in natural wild populations. But, you know, what's the first thing, you know, anybody thinks of when you start talking about radiation? It's cancers, right? You know, that's what we all sort of jump to, and so we thought we better look for cancers in our critters as well. And again, it took us a few years to capture enough birds and rodents to do the statistical analysis that's necessary to do this rigorously. And but when we had, again, very, very clear that again, much higher frequencies of these kinds of developmental anomalies, tumors and various other growths that just not seen in most natural populations. So here's an example. This is, I tell my students I'm going to Ukraine to study great tits, and they think it's funny. I don't know why. But the great tit is, you know, a common species in Europe. Pretty ornery little beast, tough as nails. They actually do relatively well, and they're one of the species that actually doesn't show much of an effect of radiation, but they do have an increased rate of these kinds of tumors. Here's one around the eye. We tend to see them frequently on the head. Here's a nightingale with one on top of its head. Here's another one on its wing. That one's kind of obvious, nasty looking thing. And again, just a variety of different developmental malformations that you don't see in most natural populations. And I gave a lecture today at Cal State San Marco and asked the students, you know, so why is it that we don't see these kinds of anomalies in nature very often? Any thoughts? Because they die. Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you had one of these growth forms, you're very likely not to, you know, you're very likely to be picked off by a predator or not find food, or certainly you're not going to find a mate. So the fact that we see these things at such, you know, at 2-3% of the population is really astounding, and the suggestion is that they're probably occurring at a much higher level and just disappearing before we get to see them. And I could give you more anecdotes of that sort at another time. So anyway, I hope, you know, isn't it surprising to you that the International Atomic Energy Agency had not done any of these kinds of studies in Chernobyl before the last 10 years? I don't know. I was kind of flabbergasted because it's not rocket science, let's face it. It's pretty descriptive natural history kind of studies, and it just took somebody out there catching birds and looking at them, or mice or insects, and they just didn't do it. So it makes you kind of wonder. But the one question I really wanted to get to today was this issue that I'm sure you know, any of you who followed Chernobyl in the news or watched any of the TV programs on Chernobyl, you've seen some reference to how the animals are thriving, right? This is, you know, there's a fence around it, there's no hunting, so the animals have taken off. And the media people just can't help themselves. They're just drawn to that Cinderella story so much. So despite the fact that, you know, we've published 20 plus papers specifically on that question, you know, one paper comes out that suggests that maybe they're thriving in the zone, and, you know, they get, you know, written up all over the place in every TV program. And it's really, like, you know, everybody likes a positive message, I know. So how do you get at this question in a rigorous way? Rather than just sort of anecdotal reports. You know, I went to Chernobyl, I saw a moose, everything must be fine. That's really been largely the extent of these kinds of reports. So how do you get at this question in a convincing, statistically robust, rigorous manner? And so it turns out that Chernobyl and Fukushima, to a lesser extent, provide the ideal opportunity for highly replicated comparisons of radioactive and unradioactive or non-radioactive areas that are about the same kind of habitat all over the landscape. This isn't the best map to show this, but basically wanted to make the point that the radioactivity is highly patchy. Some areas are really radioactive, and then half a mile away it's relatively clean, and it's dispersed across the landscape. And in fact, you have these areas over here in Belarus and Russia where you have the same kind of patchwork, but they're 150 miles away. So really kind of an independent spot. And so what we've done to get at this question, and also to address the issue that no one was looking at these critters before the accident. So you really don't know what the baseline is. So you have to come up with a model to infer what the baseline is. The way we've done it is to go to hundreds of locations, about 300 locations in Chernobyl, scattered across Ukraine and Belarus. We tried to go to Russia, but they put us in jail. So yeah, it's more a story for a vodka, but later. So 300 locations surveyed 3 times in the late 70s, 2000s, I mean. And in Fukushima, we've been tracking the birds and insects since July of 2011 at 400 locations, again scattered across hot and cold areas in the region. And we use, some of you in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with multivariate statistics and the use of GIS. But basically, we do this highly replicated, massively replicated biotic inventory. And that just means we make a list of every species we see, mostly birds and insects, at each of these 400 locations. We've done it 4 times now for 4 different years. And we count the numbers of each species as well. But we also record all of the other environmental variables that might be important for determining whether or not an individual species is there. Is there water? What's the soil type? What kind of vegetation? Is it close to a road? What time of day is it? What's the weather like? All of those kinds of things, plus measures of radiation and some kind of, sometimes we reconstruct the dose to the individual species. Some GIS, Geographic Information System, and our multivariate statistics to basically look at the partial effects of radiation while removing all of these other environmental factors across the landscape. And that's why you need so many of these points. When you do that, and you publish all these papers, and that's just to show you that that it's real. Anyway, I was going to say something else, but this was the first result. It's a little crude. From Chernobyl, basically, if you go to areas of high radiation levels, there are many fewer individuals, approximately a third, compared to the relatively clean areas. And this is not related to distance from the reactor. This is independent of distance. This is factoring out the other environmental factors. This is the radiation effect. If you look at biodiversity or species richness, you're much more likely to see multiple species at a given point. Each one of these dots represents a given biotic inventory. You're much more likely to see multiple species at a given spot in the relatively uncontaminated areas as compared to the clean areas. And basically we've done this for all of the major groups that are possible to do. For the mammals, we've actually taken a slightly different approach. We've used tracking in the snow. So we've gone to Ukraine and waited for a fresh snowfall and then gone out and tracked the animals, run transects to count the numbers. There's not so many different kinds of mammals that you can't do it from their footprints. And again, all of the critters except the wolf show negative, as groups, show negative responses, have lower densities in the more radioactive areas, 25 years plus after the disaster. What about Fukushima? So the first year in Fukushima, we found that a few of the species of birds showed marked drop-offs in the areas of high contamination, as did butterflies and the cicadas. But the spiders actually increased in the more radioactive areas. And it's kind of bizarre. We think it's because, well, any ideas? Why would spiders go up in an area?
Eat the dead insect?
Well, maybe the insects are easier to catch. That's one thought we had, and certainly fewer predators. Oh, thank you very much. You're not a plant, but fewer predators. We think it's because there are fewer birds. That's one hypothesis. But anyway, each data point here represents a corrected abundance at a given point in space and time, and again, highly significant drop-offs in numbers in the more radioactive areas. And if we look at species richness, the number of species, again, you're much less likely to find more than 1 or 2 species in these high radioactive areas. And I don't know, let's see if the video will work. And you know what they say about a picture being worth 1,000 words. A video is worth 1,000 pictures, especially if it's got audio. Let's see if it works. Uh-oh. Okay, let's try again. PC, work. Well, it's not going to work. The bottom, what it was supposed to show you is that there are lots of birds singing here, and sort of typical. And up the road, just 10 miles in a much more radioactive area, it's almost dead silence, and it's really overwhelming. If you're a birder, any birders in the audience? You know, if you're a birder, it's really, really obvious that the numbers are down. So, yeah.
So birds fly, so 10 miles away, and you're talking about population and over generations, and why are there 10 miles away, there are birds singing, and none over there? Do the birds that are singing don't even go over there anymore? Go to the other place?
No, they do go.
And re-exposed?
So it's hard to say exactly what's going on. Clearly, their survival and reproduction of many species is lower in these more radioactive areas, but there is still immigration coming in. So in Chernobyl, where we've done a lot more work than Japan, we know, in fact, for instance, for the barn swallows, based on stable isotope analysis of museum specimens versus contemporary specimens, that these populations in the more radioactive areas of Chernobyl are actually only being sustained as a result of constant immigration from adjacent areas. We can see it in the fingerprint. The stable isotope ratios tell you, that they were born in different places when you look at an individual, so you know that they came in from adjacent populations. And so we think that these are black holes from a population standpoint, and if there weren't immigration, they would actually go locally extinct for the most part. But there's always, natural populations are dynamic. It's the balance of births, deaths, immigration, and emigration that determines how many critters are actually in a given spot. Here in Fukushima, we've gotten a little bit older, and we've been slapped around a little bit over the years, and so we decided to be more rigorous in our the radiation part of the equation, the dosimetry part. And so we actually teamed up with a group in France to reconstruct the doses to the 7,000 individual birds that we had been counting over the previous 4 years, to look at a real dose-response relationship in a way that the toxicologists and the radioecologists could hopefully appreciate. And basically, again, it looks like this. And this is the main point here is that this is a relatively straight line. This is a straight line with relatively small confidence intervals. It's a nice declining line, again, with population sizes dropping with increased predicted dose to these individuals. And the basic line, the best fit to this relationship is a log linear kind of relationship. So it's there's no evidence of any kind of threshold in the data. It's fairly clear that there's this negative impact, no matter how you look at it, and that radiation is the most likely cause. The fact that we have replicated the same findings in both Chernobyl and in Fukushima, 2 completely independent spots that have not been, they're not linked at all. Again, that's the strongest evidence for the importance of the radiation. we've got genetic effects, we've got injuries to individuals, we've got population effects, we've got community effects. You know, as an ecologist, you know, the next level is this ecosystem level effect, right? And we've looked at it in a number of different ways, but one of the most fundamental processes we've tried to look at least in a cursory manner, is this issue of nutrient cycling in an ecosystem. And what got us going on this topic was, again, an anecdotal observation during one of our early visits. In this case, this was 2002. We're walking through the so-called red forest at Chernobyl. This is this vast expanse of pine forest that was killed relatively quickly within weeks of the disaster, or it was killed right away, but the trees turned red within a few weeks of the disaster, hence the name red forest. And again, thousands of acres that were killed off in this way. The trees, some of the trees were bulldozed into piles and buried because they were so radioactive, but a number of them were just left there to stand, and eventually they fall over. And 16 years after the disaster, we're walking through here, and look at these trees. It was really noticeable. They were hard. You know, you'd kick them and they were solid. And this was striking to me because all the places I've lived at and have lived in my life, apart from Death Valley, where I didn't actually live there, but you know, these trees would be sawdust within 3 years in my backyard in South Carolina. So this was kind of a striking thing, and we noticed that again anecdotally, that the leaf litter seemed to be thicker. You know, there seemed to be more of a cushion in these areas of high radioactivity, and it sort of, you know, the light bulb went on, suggesting that maybe nutrient cycling, microbial activity might be affected. And so we actually set up an experiment and wrote a paper or two, and this is just to show the students that I actually do the real field work. And these are the sort of bags we put out, 600 of them with various kinds of clean, uncontaminated leaf material, put them out across the zone at areas of high and low radioactivity, and measured everything we needed to know about the soil and humidity and other important factors, and came back a year later and weighed these bags and found that the rate of decomposition was reduced by about 50% in the more radioactive areas. And so these are averages for different transect lines, but basically very, very strong signal of radiation effect on the decomposition rate. And so again, why is this important? Well, a couple of reasons. You know, one is nutrient cycling is, you know, a major driver of primary productivity, and, you know, what makes things grow. If you don't have the dead plant material decomposing, it's going to be a depauperate, nutrient depauperate kind of environment. So that's really critical, and we do actually see a signal of reduced tree growth rates of the pine trees in these more radioactive areas. Initially, we thought it was the direct effects of radiation, but I'm thinking more and more it might be this effect that's driving tree growth variability. But potentially more important, and this should be a topic of interest to some of you, we felt that one of the big issues was the fact that this represented a huge hazard should there be forest fires in the area, because all of this leaf litter, all this rotting plant material was highly radioactive. And so if it caught fire, and we knew that there were fires from time to time, if it caught fire, particularly if it was a large, intense fire, there was the possibility of redistributing these radionuclides to other inhabited parts of Europe. And so we wrote a paper for Ecological Monographs, came out last spring, and lo and behold, and where we predicted that there could be significant consequences, especially for the firefighters, but also for people living downwind. And of course, there were 3 major forest fires in Chernobyl last year, covered in the news, and you know, 2 of them were in areas that were relatively clean, probably started by, you know, people throwing cigarette butts out the window the usual way, but one of them was in an area of fairly high contamination. And so we just, this paper actually just came out a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday, and basically where we've actually modeled how much of this radioactivity was released from the forest fires this past year, And the short answer is that it wasn't a significant risk for people living in Germany or Scandinavia, but the people living in Belarus, 100 miles away, probably experienced maybe a 30% increase in their annual dose as a result of these forest fires. So, again, if this happens year after year, that's potentially significant in terms of a health risk. And this is just to show, you can see, this was another anecdote that related to the tree growth. But we first realized that the trees were affected one winter when we were doing the mammal surveys. We were stuck behind a group of foresters who were cutting fire breaks, and they were stacking all these trees up along the roadside. And I looked over at this pile of trees, and see this color change here? And you notice how it's at about the same width, the outer layer, and whether the tree was old or young, large or small, and the light bulb went off again. So I jumped out of the car, and because they're pine trees, they're really easy to count the rings. And sure enough, this change in color, change in wood density, actually all occurred at about the time of the Chernobyl event. And so we subsequently cored all of these trees and analyzed the cores and found that growth rates were significantly lower, especially in the first 5 years after the disaster. But going right back to the beginning, the whole reason we started going to Chernobyl, again, wasn't just because it justified a week in southern Spain, but it also, we thought, provided an opportunity to look for a novel, potentially novel kind of adaptation to this novel kind of environmental perturbation, and increased mutagenic environment, and so we asked the question this year for the 30th anniversary whether or not anyone has shown any level of adaptation to this environment. And originally we thought we would see maternal effects evolving, mothers allocating more antioxidants to eggs and stuff like that. But the bottom line is there have only been maybe 17 studies that we could find that even attempted to address this question, and only one of the 17 showed any evidence of anything approaching adaptive responses to the radioactivity. Turns out that, and we've done a couple of studies on for instance, this is one just came out today or last week on fungus, where we actually sequenced the entire genome of the parasitic fungus that parasites different kinds of plants. And it was kind of interesting because we found no evidence of increased mutation rates in these genomes. What we did find, though, is selection against some of the genetic variability. So it represented some kind of truncation selection or purifying selection, but no evidence of adaptation. And this is another paper that has come out recently showing that in bacteria, again, looking at bacteria collected from different levels of radioactivity, bringing them into the lab, and then zapping them with radiation, basically finding that, again, all of the bacteria from all of the sites respond negatively to radiation in terms of growth rates in the lab, although one of the populations, isolates from one of the populations, seem to do relatively better relative to the other population sources, but still very negatively with respect to radiation. So again, no evidence of any kind of real evolution or adaptive evolution, even for the bacteria. So bottom line, those government reports that we all read and cite all the time, well, look at who the authors are. It seems like there are opportunities under some circumstances for these reports to not be an accurate reflection of the literature. I think there are a number of different reasons for that. I think the International Atomic Energy Agency is a little bit different than some of the other United Nations agencies. It was brought up earlier today that the IPCC has done a great job at characterizing the issues related to climate change. That was a collection of thousands of scientists from all kinds of institutions working collectively in a relatively democratic way. The Chernobyl Forum and UNSCAR don't work that way. They are appointees from governments, from nuclear regulatory agencies, and they seem to be missing, deliberately ignoring a large part of the literature. We have found over and over again many examples, not just us, that clearly these low dose rates, when the organisms are exposed chronically over multiple generations, show consequences. It's been shown that animals living in the wild, organisms living in the wild, are considerably more susceptible to this kind of chronic dose exposure than animals living in the lab. Again, for the aficionados in the room, all of the relationships that we've looked at show something like a proportional increase, but no threshold below which there's no effect. So a little radiation has a small effect, a lot of radiation has a big effect, and really no strong evidence of adaptation. And let me just skip ahead and say, ask the question, why should we care? Chernobyl was kind of unique. 3 Mile, as you mentioned, 3 Mile Island, still debated. Where's all the data from 3 Mile Island? What are all the studies from 3 Mile Island? Where are they? But Chernobyl was a unique event, kind of associated with former Soviet Union and their management style, their technology. Fukushima was a natural disaster. Turns out, some folks think that there's a very high probability of another accident on a Chernobyl scale by 2050, maybe a Fukushima scale in much less time, based on an analysis of accidents and incidents. So that's one reason. Another reason for being interested, again, there's been a lot of discussion, especially after the issues in Belgium, the terrorist attacks in Belgium. A lot of interest, a lot of concern for the potential for both nuclear and dirty bomb kinds of events. So those are reasons for being interested. But what's the main reason we should be interested in radiation consequences? Anybody have any thoughts beyond these environmental things? So it turns out the main source of increasing radiation in our personal environments comes from medical sources. How many of you in this room have had a CAT scan? Yeah, so CAT scan, the typical CAT scan gives a dose of about 6 millisieverts, plus or minus. They're trying to get it down, but that's about twice your normal annual dose. And so it turns out that these low doses from medical sources are rising dramatically in the Western world in particular. So again, there's a lot we can learn that might be of relevance to us in our everyday lives by studying the birds and the bees. And with that, I will stop and just mention, of course, that none of this could have been done without the help of a large number of people in many different continents, and I'm very grateful to them. And thank you all for coming out tonight. And thank you for your enthusiasm. That's great.